Thank you all for being here this morning. It's so good to see each of you. And if you'd like to open to Proverbs chapter 10, we're going to be in Proverbs chapter 10 this morning. A different proverb, you don't have to turn there, but a different proverb. Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 15 says, "The leech has two daughters, give and give." And it's kind of a comical proverb, but it's also true that, we've all known people like that. They just take, and they don't ever have a sense of giving back, or it seemed like they never quite learned that lesson, that life isn't just about me. And that seems like one of those lessons that we have to learn, everyone pretty much has to learn when we're little, that not everything revolves around me. And so it's very fitting that as Solomon gets into the main part of the book of Proverbs, one of the first things that he tries to show us, that wisdom understands, that I have to be concerned about more than just myself, more than just me. Now, a couple weeks ago, we looked at Proverbs 1 through 9, and that's really his introduction. That's where he makes his case, where he shows us why wisdom is the best path, why we should love wisdom, why we should want to pursue after wisdom. He says, in all you're getting, if you get anything, get wisdom, because of the great value that comes with it. But Proverbs chapter 10 begins what we think of as really the true Proverbs. Short, usually about 2 lines long, kind of pithy statements that the more that you think about each one of them, the more truth and depth you find to them. And he opens this section of Proverbs with these kind of short statements. The first 2 chapters, 10 and 11, really focus on this idea. It's about more than just me. And he's going to do that with every proverb. He shows us these 2 different paths. Right? Now, there are paths that go in opposite directions, and just kind of as a spoiler alert, the one path is always the same. It's always wisdom, right? This is the book of Proverbs. One of those paths is always going to be wisdom, although he does look at it kind of in different aspects along the way. But then the other path, the foolish path, he shows us through different ways that we can choose the foolish path. For example, in chapter 10, he really focuses on selfishness. That whenever we choose selfishness, when we choose to do things that only benefit us or that put us higher than others, then we're choosing the foolish path instead of the path of wisdom. And you notice he's going to describe this as paths that go in opposite directions, which tells us there's no gray area, there's no middle ground there. When we choose selfishness, we are inherently choosing the opposite of wisdom. There is no choice that is both selfish and wise. And then chapter 11, he's going to really focus on greed. And so chapter 10 is about selfishness. Chapter 11, he kind of hones in a little deeper, and he's going to focus just specifically on the idea of greediness versus wisdom, and how we have to make a choice, one or the other. And so let's start in Proverbs chapter 10. Proverbs chapter 10, where he is really focusing on selfishness. And this, in the big picture, this is what he's going to say in both chapters. When we choose selfishness or when we choose greed, what we're choosing is harm. We're choosing harm for ourselves. We're choosing harm for the people who are around us. Selfishness and greed can only hurt. And wisdom is how we help ourselves. Wisdom is how we help other people. Wisdom is how we make the most of this life. And when you think about selfishness, the wise path, the opposite of that, is selflessness. That we are putting others first. Now, selflessness does not mean that we don't like ourselves or that we don't love ourselves. Selflessness does not mean that we don't take care of ourselves. Selflessness is, well, maybe it's helpful to think about it this way. Jesus talks about our priorities in life. What is it that he says is the greatest command? The first command, he says, is to love God with all that you are. And so that's God. That's not me, right? I'm definitely not God. And so, right, that's loving God. And then the second command, like it, he says, the second command is to love your neighbor. And so again, that's not me. The focus is on loving somebody else. But how do you love your neighbor? He says you love your neighbor as yourself, right? The way that you love yourself, as if he were or she were you. And so it is right to love yourself. You cannot love your neighbor if you do not love yourself. It is right to take care of yourself. But the focus, he says, is not self. Those commands focus on God and on the people who are around us. And so that's really what Proverbs 10 and 11 are about as well. The focus is that my actions and my words, big or small, whatever they are, they impact other people. And we should be mindful of that as we make these decisions. Let's notice just a few of these passages. Let's notice in chapter 10 what happens when we choose the foolish path. He says in verse 1, he says, the second half of it, a foolish son is the grief of his mother. There are decisions that cause other people harm and grief. He says it in verse 4. He says, he who has a slack hand becomes poor. When we choose in this moment, just selfishly, I don't feel like doing the things I'm supposed to do. I don't feel like taking out the trash or going to work or whatever. He says that's going to impact you down the road. Later, you is going to wish you had done those things today, isn't he or she? He says in verse 5, he says, he who sleeps in harvest is a son who causes shame. And that's when we just selfishly decide, I just don't want to do that. I don't feel like going to work today. I could. I just don't feel like it. When you lose your job, your wife and your children are going to be hurt by that. Your family is going to be impacted by those selfish and lazy choices that we sometimes make. And so, he says it in verse 6. He says, violence covers the mouth of the wicked. Selfishness hurts other people. He says on in verse 12, he says, hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all sins. And so if you hate somebody and you find out what it is that they struggle with, you find out what their sin or their temptation is, that person, you're going to share with everybody. You're going to tell everyone you know about what they're struggling with. And it's going to cause hurt, and it's going to cause harm. It's going to cause strife, he says, difficulties, the breaking up of relationships. He says, but love covers all sins. And that's, if you find out that someone is struggling with something, you're just going to go to them and you're going to help them through it. And you're not going to feel the need to tell everybody else about it. You might pull in one or two other people if they can help in a way that you can't, but you're not going to share it all around, and so it covers that sin. There's a discretion that is wise there. He says on in verse 14, he says, the mouth of the foolish is near to destruction. Verse 15, the destruction of the poor is their poverty. And then verse 16, the wages of the wicked to sin. Verse 17, he who refuses correction goes astray. And so that sort of self-absorbed, I won't listen, I don't care, big picture, it causes harm. But when you come back around to look at what the wise path chooses, he says in verse 1, he says, a wise son makes a glad father. It's a benefit to the people who are around you. He says in verse 4 that the hand of the diligent makes rich. Verse 5, he who gathers in summer is a wise son. Every choice that we are making, it does have an impact on the people who are around us. And so we can't just make choices with just me in mind. We must make choices thinking about how is this going to impact other people, because they're either going to be hurt by it or they're going to benefit from it. Verse 6, blessings are in the head of the righteous. People want to remember them. Verse 7, he says in verse 8, they receive commands. And it says there after that in verse 8, he says, a prating fool will fall. Have you ever known someone that we could call a prating fool? This is a person who, they just talk all the time. They just talk and and what they talk about mostly is just themselves. It's just a kind of constant, they talk about whatever they're scared of. They talk about how people have hurt them, just whatever they're thinking about. They don't stop to listen. They don't want to hear about you or about other people. They just talk and talk and talk and talk. And if you just talk about yourself long enough, you're going to say something that you probably shouldn't say. You're going to reveal somebody's secret that you probably shouldn't reveal. He goes on And you notice in verse 19, he says, in the multitude of words, sin is not lacking. That's if you talk long enough. James says it this way in James chapter 3. He says the tongue is the hardest thing to tame. Of all of your body parts, of all of the things that you do, the tongue is the hardest thing to tame. If you talk long enough, you're going to put your foot in there eventually, aren't you? You're going to say something that you should not have said. And that's why verse 19, he says, he who restrains his lips is wise. There is a time to just stop talking about something, just to end that conversation. And we've said enough about this. Let's move on, because we don't want to put ourselves in that kind of temptation or in that kind of place. And so he says this is the wise path. He says in verse 9, he who walks with integrity walks securely. It may not always seem like it. Oftentimes people are selfish because they're trying to take care of themselves. They're trying to prevent something bad from happening. They're trying to protect themselves. But that actually just leads to harm. And even though sometimes it's the opposite of how we think it should be, when we choose selflessness, that is the safest path that you can walk on, because that's the path that God blesses, because that's the path that God has paved and laid for us. And so he says it's going to go against your instincts sometimes, but choose selflessness, choose wisdom, and watch how God makes things work out. Verse 11, he says, the mouth of the righteous is a well of life. When you think about a well, normally you dig a well really deep to get water way down. And that's when the wise speak, they're reaching way down inside of themselves to the depths and layers of their knowledge and their wisdom, and pulling up something worth saying, something, he says, that helps people. He says down in verse 21, the lips of the righteous feed many, that people are benefited by what you say. They're nourished and they're encouraged and they're strengthened by the things that you say. It says in verse 14, wise people store up knowledge. They're thinking about this so that they're ready to do or to speak the right things. And verse 16, the labor of the righteous leads to life. And verse 17, he who keeps instruction is in the way of life. And really, what it comes down to is, especially when you're concerning words, he says, it's the kind of words that you use. Notice verse 18, he talks about lying lips and slander. Whoever spreads slander is a fool. In other words, he says, there is not one circumstance where you choose to lie that you are choosing the right path, that you are choosing the path of wisdom. It's easy to convince ourselves sometimes. Just a little white lie. Just cover it up a little bit and just twist the truth slightly, and it's going to save everybody a lot of trouble. Now, he did talk about discretion, right? He's talked about, it covers over other people's sins sometimes. You don't have to say everything you know. But there's never an occasion where telling a lie is the same thing as walking on the path of wisdom. They are in opposite directions, and if you are choosing a lie, you're choosing harm. You're choosing the path of foolishness. And so it's about choosing the right words to say. And then again, choosing, verse 20, notice he says, the tongue of the righteous is choice silver. Now, choice silver, that's kind of the idea, like if you were at an estate sale and you found a box of silverware and you thought, this is authentic silver, this is what silver used to be made out of when people polish their silver, and you think, I'm going to buy this, but first you're going to have someone authenticate it. They're going to go through and they're going to say, yeah, this is the real deal right here. You're going to want to buy that one. No, this is a fake imitation. Impressive, but not the real deal. Set that aside. That's the idea. The tongue of the righteous is choice silver. They're looking at their words before they're saying them, and they're thinking, yes, this is going to edify people. Like Ephesians chapter 4 says, let all your words be to build people up, not to tear them down. This is gonna help somebody. I'll say that. No, this is something that I just want to say to make myself feel better. This is something I just want to say because I just feel too upset right now. I don't have my emotions under control. This is something that I just want to say to put them down, or whatever it is. I'm not going to choose that. It's not authentically helpful. It's not good. And so we're throwing those words away and we're not going to use them. It's the kind of mindset that everything I says matters. And therefore, before I say it, I just want to ask, is this the path of wisdom? Is it honest? Is it right? Is it helpful? Or is it going to take me down the path of the fool and cause harm to other people? And that's why he says in verse 21 that it feeds many. But the reason why it matters so much, why we choose this path, is because he says they have such different destinations. Wisdom and selfishness have such different destinations. And that's what he says in verses 23 to 32. Verses 23 to 32, he describes these destinations. Notice, let's start in verse 24. Notice just the ones about selfishness. He says, the fear of the wicked will come upon him. Verse 25, when the whirlwind passes by, the wicked is no more. Even he says in verse 26, he says, even just putting your trust in someone who is selfish, it's going to come back to bite you. He says, as vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so is the lazy man to those who send him. Right? That's going to come back to bite you. Verse 27, the years of the wicked will be shortened. The expectation of the wicked will perish. The destruction will come to the workers of iniquity. The wicked will not inhabit the earth. The perverse tongue will be cut out. The mouth of the wicked only speaks what is perverse. He says it just creates a situation where you just say more and more of the wrong thing and get closer and closer to the wrong destination. But you don't have to choose that path. That's the great thing about the Proverbs. Solomon wouldn't write the Proverbs if we didn't have a choice in this matter. And although sometimes it seems like wisdom is the furthest thing away from us, I have days like that where I just think, I have no idea what the wise thing to do is. I'm just messing everything up. Although sometimes it seems like wisdom is so far away, he says over and over in Proverbs, it doesn't matter if you're highly educated or you've never had a day of school in your life. It doesn't matter if you think of yourself as highly intelligent or highly stupid. It doesn't matter what your background is or where you come from or who you are. If you want wisdom, if you'll pursue wisdom diligently, you can have it. It's the guarantee that God gives. And so if you want the wisdom to know what to say and what to do in any given moment, chase that wisdom down. The destination is worth it. He says in verse 24, the desire of the righteous will be granted. Verse 25, the righteous has an everlasting foundation. Something that you can always turn back to. Something that always will catch your feet. He says, 27, the fear of the Lord prolongs days. The hope of the righteous will be gladness. The way of the Lord is strength for the upright. The righteous will never be removed. The mouth of the righteous brings forth wisdom, and the lips of the righteous know what is acceptable. Especially that last verse I love. I mean, don't you ever just wish that you just knew what to say to people when they're having hardships, or when they say something ugly to you, or, whatever it is. Sometimes, on your way home afterwards, it just hits you like, oh, that's what I should have said. But you didn't have it in the moment, and it's too late now. Don't you ever wish you just knew what to say in the moment? Wisdom can give you that. You can think, I know what to say. I know what's going to help them in this moment. And it's up to them if they listen or not, right? You can't make people listen. But if they'll listen, I know that this will benefit them. That's the promise that Solomon gives us. If we just chase that wisdom down, reject selfishness, and selflessly walk through this life seeking his wisdom, every day we'll get closer and closer to knowing what to say, knowing what to do, and having that kind of confidence that Solomon, at his best, had. Now that's chapter 10. Chapter 11 focuses specifically on the idea of greed. I think maybe it's kind of hard to understand, why would anyone choose greed? Why is that a path that people struggle with? And I think when it comes down to it, let's just take one, for example, just one reason why people maybe choose greed. And that's, take yourselves back to the dark days of COVID, right? Those early days when they all told us to shelter at home. And what is it that everybody went and got at the grocery stores? Toilet paper, right? And so you have this situation where you have neighbors, and one of them has the money to buy toilet paper, but they can't find any toilet paper anywhere. And the other one has their garage stacked all the way floor to ceiling with toilet paper that they're just not using, right? And that's, in essence, that's the idea of greed. You, for whatever reason, you take more than what you need. You hoard more than is necessary to the hurt of other people. And so that's, why did people buy all that toilet paper? They were scared. And they thought, if I take all of this for myself, then I'll be secure. I'll always know that I have enough toilet paper for the things that we need it for. That there was that fear there, and they thought if I walk down the path of greed, if I take all of this, I will be taken care of. Right? And so that's the allure of greed. It makes us feel secure. It makes us feel safe. Now, sometimes people are greedy because they're proud, right? I deserve all of this, and I should have all of it. Sometimes people are greedy because of their lust, right? I just want it, and I don't care who needs it. I'm just going to take it for myself. But sometimes it's just because we're scared, and that leads us into greediness. And so, in a way, it kind of makes sense why people sometimes choose greed in order to secure themselves. But that's the point of these first 8 verses of chapter 11 is that's a lie that you're believing. If you choose greed thinking it's going to make you secure, it does not work out that way. Verse 1, he talks about dishonest scales. Right? Be like, if you went to Walmart and you put your grapes to weigh them, you're going to buy a pound of grapes, but they charged you for 5 pounds of grapes, even though you only bought, right? That's dishonest scales. He says dishonesty, gouging people, charging more than what it's worth because, there's a big storm coming and so we can jack up the gas prices. That's dishonest scales. And he says that's an abomination to the Lord. Right? That the worst kind of sin, the kind that we should be highly ashamed of. Verse 2, when pride comes, then comes shame. Verse 3, he says that the perversity of the unfaithful will destroy them. Verse 4, riches do not profit in the day of wrath. It does not matter how much money you have in your bank account. When judgment day comes, it's not going to mean a thing. And so hoarding all of this or taking more than we need, it doesn't benefit us in the long run. He says, verse 5, the wicked will fall by his own wickedness. And verse 6, the unfaithful will be caught by their lust. Eventually, greed always catches up with you, is what he's saying there. And so he says it may have the appearance of helping you out, but ultimately it causes harm to you and to the people who are around you. And that's why verse 1, he says, a just weight, right? Honesty, fairness, that's what delights God. Verse 2, he says, with the humble is wisdom. And that's one of those kind of special verses where he makes it real plain of what is the opposite of greed? It's humility. Greed takes more than it needs. Humility is the idea of literally kind of bending down so that you can lift somebody else up. You can lift up God's glory. You can help somebody else out. And so it's putting somebody else first by being the one who lifts them and who helps them out. And so you can either take or you can be one who gives. And he says, even though it doesn't always make sense to us, the one who gives is the one who, in the long run, is going to benefit the most. And we'll see that more plainly later in this chapter. He says in verse 3, the integrity of the upright will guide them, that righteousness delivers. Notice that emphasis. What delivers us from the troubles of this life? It's not taking more than we need. It's doing the right thing. That's what he says in verse 4. He says the righteousness of the blameless will direct his way of right. And verse 6, the righteousness of the upright will deliver them. Don't listen to the deception of greed. Just keep doing the right things when you're scared, whatever it is. And God is going to work that out for good. He always does. And he says that's true for you. And it's true for everyone who is around you. Verse 8, verse 9, I'm sorry. Verse 9, he says, the hypocrite with his mouth destroys his neighbor. Right? I tell you that I want good things for you, but then I'm going to go around and I'm going to say whatever I have to bring you down so that I can take something that you have, something that I want. It harms our neighbors when we are greedy. It says in verse 10, he says, when it goes well with the righteous, the city rejoices. Right? Choosing the path of wisdom benefits everyone, he says, but when the wicked perish, there is jubilation. There's rejoicing because they were hurting everybody. They were causing harm to the people who were around them. He says in verse 12, he who is devoid of wisdom despises his neighbor, but a man of understanding holds his peace. And then related to that, verse 13, a talebearer reveals secrets, but he who is of a faithful spirit conceals a matter. And so, again, it's devoid of wisdom to take people's troubles and to go and tell everybody about it, right? He says the talebearer is greedy for gossip. They just can't wait to hear the next juicy detail so that they can tell everybody about it, but that causes harm, versus the wise man who understands when to hold his peace, the woman who knows this is not something I should just share with anybody. This could be hurtful information. It doesn't mean that we ignore people's sins. We work with them about it, but not everybody has to know about that. He who is of a faithful spirit conceals a matter. We don't have to say everything that we know. And he's going to say this over and over again in the book of Proverbs. And so he goes on to describe here, he says in verse 17, look at the trouble that comes. He says, he who is cruel troubles his own flesh. He says in verse 18, he says, the wicked man does deceptive work, but he who sows righteousness will have a sure reward. He says then also in verse 20, he says, those who are of a perverse heart are an abomination to the Lord. And verse 21, though they join forces, the wicked will not go unpunished, right? All the wicked people in the world could get together and hoard everything to themselves, but God is going to make all of that right. God is going to do the right thing and the just thing. And so verse 23 kind of sums it up. He says, the expectation of the wicked is wrath. And that's all that can come when we choose the path of greed. We are choosing the wrath that follows after that. Verse 24, he kind of explains how this works. He says, there's one who scatters that increases more. This is kind of a farming analogy, right? If you hoard all of your seeds and you never put them in the ground, they don't really benefit you that much, do you? But if you throw those seeds out, they're going to produce for you. They're going to grow things. He says there's one who withholds more than is right. Right? And so you can withhold, right? He doesn't say you shouldn't have savings, but then you can withhold more than is right. And that's, you see people hurting and you have the savings and you think, well, they should have saved more on their own, and you don't do anything to help them out. You see an occasion to help, but you say, these are my savings. I'm not going to help people with this. He says, there is one who withholds more than is right, and that leads to poverty. The generous soul will be made rich, and he who waters will also be watered himself, and the people will curse him who withholds grain, but blessings will be on the head of him who sells it. It doesn't always make sense to us, but he says, the more generous that you are, and that's, you're going to have friends who, when you're in trouble, they're going to come and they're going to help you out. And God sees that, and he's going to take care of you. The more that we think, I've got to take care of myself, I've got to save up all of this on my own, and never help people regardless of how bad it gets, the more that no one's going to be there to help us when those riches fail us. And riches always do. They always fail at some point or another. They're like wind. They just slip away when you least expect it. And there'll be no one there to help you because you are not there to help others. And God sees that, he says. And so it goes against our nature sometimes, but he says, seek after good. Verse 27, if you are seeking after good, you find favor with God and favor with man. Trouble will come to him who seeks evil. Remember, in context, evil is not the things that we necessarily think of. It's not talking necessarily about murder or lust or anything like that. He's just talking about greed. He's just talking about those who hoard off those things and won't help other people. Verse 28, he who trusts in riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like foliage. He who troubles his own house will inherit the wind, and the fool will be a servant to the wise of heart. The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life. He who wins souls is wise. If the righteous will be recompensed on the earth, how much more the ungodly and the sinner? And so all of that really, he says, greed is a deception that we must be aware of. We must know it never pays in the end. Wisdom saves many, he says. And especially, notice he said that in verse 30. Wisdom doesn't just save you. It saves many. Humility is what puts you and many others on that path to security and to salvation. And so, selfishness and greed, they are the exact opposite of wisdom. They have an opposite path, they have an opposite destination. And it's up to us to remember that. And each day to be aware, if we are choosing those paths, we absolutely are not choosing God's path of wisdom. And to make the choice for ourselves. What kind of person do I want to be today? What kind of life do I want to be living tomorrow? What kind of path do I want to walk on? Because it's in your hands to make that choice. But we, of course, don't have to walk that path alone. We want to walk the path of wisdom if we want to find it. We have the scriptures and we have each other. And if we can help you to find that path this morning, we ask that you come forward as we stand and as we sing.